Today's episode of Wild World is sponsored by Lindblad Expeditions. Discovery is in the Lindblad DNA. Visit expeditions.com to see where in our wild world you'd like to explore with Lindblad Expeditions. There are few places in the world where you can feel like you're really getting a glimpse of what the world was like before humans existed. One of those places is the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos are a cluster of islands located right on the equator in the eastern Pacific Ocean. They're about 560 miles west of mainland South America and belong to the country of Ecuador.
Galapagos, I know it so intimately. It's like a lifelong partner. By looking at the tilt of the leaves, I can tell you what the climate has been like in the last 3 months. By looking at how fat or skinny the marine iguanas are, I can tell you what the water temperature has been like. There's nowhere else in the world where I have that kind of intimacy with the entire environment of one place. And that's like coming back to a long-lost lover whom I know extremely well.
This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon. In today's episode, we get two very different perspectives about the Galapagos Islands, a place with unique wildlife, active volcanoes, and a rich undersea world. Charles Darwin's visit to the Galapagos Islands in 1835 helped inspire his theory of evolution by natural selection. He described the islands as a little world within itself. What first caught his attention was that the mockingbirds on nearby islands were slightly different, even though the islands have similar environments. Although he only spent 5 weeks there, he would later reflect on his observations in Galapagos as the origin of all my views. Like Darwin, visiting Galapagos as a young man had a profound impact on me too. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to visit them twice as a college student, first as a tourist and later as a researcher. I was absolutely enamored by the fascinating animals, like giant tortoises and marine iguanas, that I encountered there, all of which have almost no fear of humans. It was on that second trip that I made the decision to become a biologist. While brief visits to Galapagos can be life-changing, imagine what it's like to grow up there. Tui De Roy was born in Belgium, but her family moved to the Galapagos Islands in 1955, when she was just 2 years old. The islands were largely uninhabited, and her family lived as pioneers. I'm Scott Solomon. You're listening to Wild World. My guest is nature photographer and lifelong Galapagos resident, Tui De Roy. Welcome, Tui.
Hello.
To start off, tell me where you are right now.
Okay, so I'm on Santa Cruz Island in the Galapagos Islands, the island that I grew up on. I hope my little dog behaves and stays put. Yeah, I tied him to a mangrove. We're underneath the mangroves, and he likes to explore, but he's patient. I live in Puerto Ayora, which now is a town of over 25,000 people. When I first arrived on my second birthday, when my family moved to Galapagos, there were probably no more than a few dozen people living in this village.
Yeah, so you mentioned your family moved to Galapagos when you were just 2. I imagine that's probably too early for you to remember it yourself, but what is your earliest memory?
Well, I don't remember the departure from Belgium. I don't remember the trip on the ship, a banana boat coming to Guayaquil and then a smaller cargo boat from Guayaquil to Galapagos. But I do have some clear memories during our first year, because in the first year we homesteaded in the highlands, and my parents broke land and planted a garden, and there were some large elephant ear plants growing near the tent that we lived in. And I remember walking underneath the leaves of the elephant ear plants, and they were huge above my head. So this is not somebody else's story, it's my own memory.
Right. It sounds like exactly the kind of thing a kid remembers. Yeah. So Tell me a little bit about your parents. What caused them to move from Belgium to the Galapagos Islands?
Well, they lived through World War II and saw the German occupation and the carting off of the Jewish population and all the horrors that came with it. And at age 16, my dad was away from home and he wrote a letter to his parents saying, we must escape this vicious circle of a society where we're just a tiny cog, and we must find a place where we can live in a gentle climate and live self-sufficiently. And of course his parents were city people. They must have shaken their heads no end when they read that letter, but they kept it. And so that was his dream. And when he met my mom, she found a book that described some of the people living here in the Galapagos Islands, a book written by a sailor who came through the islands. And they said, right, that must be it. And basically they had enough money to buy a one-way ticket.
Unbelievable. I mean, what an adventure and what a change. I mean, what were the Galapagos Islands like at that time? There really, as you said, weren't many people living there.
Well, the islands were very much the way the tourists see them today, except there were no tourists. 97% of the island surface was declared national park in 1959, so that's 4 years after we arrived. And that was the area where no people had any claim, any footprint. No people lived. There were, however, many problems, a lot of them caused by animals that had been introduced earlier, mammals like dogs and goats and so on, pigs. And those animals have actually been eliminated on most of the uninhabited islands. So in some ways, the islands are actually better off now than they were 200 or 300 years ago. But the small areas that were excluded from the park where people had lived already haven't expanded in area, but they have vastly expanded in population numbers. So now we have, all the modcoms, including a very wobbly internet. So, plenty of traffic and all that.
Sure. And we'll definitely talk more about what the islands are like today. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your childhood. I mean, what an interesting way to grow up. Your family lived as pioneers, essentially, right? I mean, what was your house like in those early days after arriving?
Growing up in the Galapagos Islands was obviously completely different from any other kind of childhood experience. And that involved being in nature, learning from nature. My parents were originally artists and very much naturalists at heart. So we learned together. We observed together. My parents showed me a lot of things that my father especially, that he observed around us with the wildlife. And then we kids went on to explore further on our own. And I might say that the education we got, which was homeschooling, was completely different from conventional education, even other homeschooling scenes, because my father didn't really believe in teaching us the contents of education, but rather the ability to learn. So we were taught how to learn, how to query, how to be curious. We were made to be curious about reading books, about hearing the accounts of scientists that visited the islands. But we didn't get a lot of content. The content was up to us to fill out. But we learned to read and write. Of course, my father had ideas and my mother put them into practice. That was the story of their life. So she taught my brother and I how to read and write and, count and all that. But there were the basics of learning. And the rest had to do with observing nature, mainly being curious about all sorts of things, asking questions that couldn't be answered, but wondering about them. And that's basically how I think my interest was honed in finding answers, in discovering the world. And my father was also very interested in photography. He brought along paper and chemicals to do his own black and white photography, but he didn't have a good camera. So I borrowed his camera when I was about 11 or 12, and then I acquired my own SLR when I was 16 and started to take pictures for myself just as he had been doing. But it didn't take long. About 2 years later, I actually had my first photos published, and that was a coincidence, meeting people whom you could only meet here in Galapagos, editors of magazines. When I was 19, I met the editor of Audubon magazine, and I had a cover story before the year was done. And so that could have never happened outside of Galapagos.
Right. I mean, what an incredible set of opportunities, but just also amazing circumstances that you found yourself in. And so it sounds like you were sort of always drawn towards nature and animals growing up, just being surrounded by it. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. There were not very many people around us. And yes, I had playmates, but, people are complicated. People are difficult. Animals were just so much more pure and wonderful. And to this day, I get along fine. I have a lot of friends, but, nature is my bedrock. And, you could call it my religion if I had one, but it's really my bedrock of what I use as a reference to understand processes.
Well, I want to get back to the start of your photography career. I think it's very interesting, the way that you started just sort of organically. You talked about having this opportunity to get a cover for one of your photographs. At what point did you see photography as a possible career?
I never worried too much about a career because I was going to follow in my parents' footsteps. I was invited when I was 18 actually, to go to the States and go to college. And when I was 19, I actually accepted the invitation to go to the States, but not to go to college. I just wanted to see the world and learn from that experience. But I didn't want to spend years away from the world that I knew I wanted to live in, which was Galapagos or other places like it. And so I didn't worry about what I was going to be doing. I just knew that I was going to find something to do that was going to be independent. And so when fortuitously I started publishing my photos, I thought, well, I can do this. So then I started approaching magazines. I still have the correspondence from when I first wrote to International Wildlife Magazine, which no longer exists, from the National Wildlife Federation. And, the letter took a long time to get there. And then I got an answer and, a month went by and they agreed to take an article that I would write. And it took a year to get them the photos and the manuscripts, which of course were original slides, which they then sent back many months later. And I had my first article published in a magazine where I did not have a fortuitous introduction. And so that was fun, it was rewarding, and I just continued doing that. And it went very well until the digital age came along, and now there are so many good photos everywhere that you can't really live as a professional photographer anymore.
I'm Scott Solomon. This is Wild World. When we come back, we'll hear more from Galapagos resident Tui De Roy about her work in the Galapagos Islands. If you want to see the Galapagos Islands for yourself, one of the best ways is with Lindblad Expeditions. Discovery is in the Lindblad DNA. They've been exploring the most amazing places on our planet for more than 50 years. In 1967, Lindblad brought some of the first ecotourists to the Galapagos Islands. They have the most advanced fleet of expedition ships in the world, and their trips create unprecedented opportunities for guests. As part of the Rice University Traveling Owls program, I've visited the Galapagos Islands with Lindblad, and I had some of the most memorable wildlife experiences of my life. I love the way that Lindblad make nature and wildlife accessible to anyone. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls or expeditions.com to learn more and to see where in our wild world you'd like to explore next. This is Wild World. I'm Scott Solomon, and I'm speaking with lifelong resident of the Galapagos Islands, Tui De Roy. You've traveled all over the world photographing animals and nature. Your work's been published in dozens of magazines. I think you have 21 books, and you've won quite a few awards for your work, including the North American Nature Photographer Association's Outstanding Photographer of the Year. What are some of your favorite places other than Galapagos?
Well, it's kind of hard to pinpoint because it's a bit like asking you what is your favorite child if you have several. It's very often the place that I'm in at a given time, but they all have one common denominator. They have to be as pristine as possible. And so I will probably go to Antarctica, or maybe even more so the subantarctic islands, which have a lot more variety of life, but no human presence. They do have a human footprint. The old whaling days, etc., have caused a lot of havoc, but they are pretty much pristine today. And I gravitate towards the most remote and hopefully, well, I shouldn't say unexplored, because there are no places left on the planet that are unexplored, but where few people have trod.
Sure, yeah. And yet, despite your work taking you to all of these amazing places and all 7 continents, the Galapagos Islands continue to be one of your favorite subjects for your photography and expeditions. What is it about Galapagos that's so special to you personally?
Well, it's interesting, yes, that you point that out, because essentially, just in the last few days, I've been battling with myself to write my life story, my autobiography, if you like. And I'm trying to figure out how to give it a sense of order, a thread other than chronological. And I've settled on 3 parts. The first one is growing up in Galapagos. The second one is branching out of Galapagos into other wild places, as you said, on all 7 continents. And the third one is returning to Galapagos and essentially rediscovering Galapagos with new tools, which is digital photography, because it allows you to take a lot of photos that I could never take with film. But also, more specifically to answer your question, Galapagos, I know it so intimately. It's like a lifelong partner. You know everything from within. Doesn't mean to say I know everything there is to know about Galapagos. I made a discovery a couple of years ago that led to my first ever peer-reviewed scientific paper where I was the first author, but even though I have no academic credentials whatsoever. But so there's still plenty to discover. But I can, by looking at the tilt of the leaves, I can tell you what the climate has been like in the last 3 months. By looking at how fat or skinny the marine iguanas are, I can tell you what the water temperature has been like. There's nowhere else in the world where I have that kind of intimacy with the entire environment of one place. And like I say, that's like coming back to a long-lost lover whom I know extremely well.
That's a great way to describe it. Do you have a favorite place in Galapagos?
Well, again, it's complicated because I have favorite places for different reasons. I mean, I would in some ways pick Fernandina Island because it is the most untouched island of all. It really has had nothing added and nothing subtracted by the presence of humans. It's also the youngest island. It's still growing. It's very much, the volcano is as alive as the animals that live on it. And some incredible things happen there, like one thing that I discovered and documented that no scientist has ever followed because it's really quite difficult. But most of the land iguanas, of which there are many thousands living on that volcano, actually the females migrate up to the top and down into the caldera, which is recurrently active, to nest in the warm caldera floor. And it's just an amazing thing, these animals going into the maw of the volcano to to beget their next generation. And so that to me is kind of my spiritual home, if you like, because it is just so natural, so raw. It's being itself, it's at peace with itself, even though there are often major reconstructions. As a volcanologist friend who was killed in an eruption once said, not here I might say, once said, volcanoes destroy to better rebuild. Or rather, he said, the earth destroys to better rebuild. Anyway, that's one place. But then another place is Alcedo volcano on Isabella Island, where the largest population of giant tortoises are still found. And they number in their thousands. I think the official number is somewhere between 10 and 15,000, but I rather suspect that there's more. So they still operate as landscape engineers. They actually create clearings, they create water holes, they are really bound to the land the way they no longer are on islands where they were depleted. And the third place are the northernmost outposts, Darwin and Wolf Islands, where you get these great gatherings of hammerhead sharks on the deep walls that drop off into the abyss. And on top of the islands, you have the vampire finch, which is one of the 17 species of Darwin's finches that has learned to peck at the base of nesting seabirds' wing feathers, boobies mainly, and draw blood when it's very dry, when they need moisture and protein. So, it's just one of these places where, you couldn't invent a place like that if you tried.
So, of course, the Galapagos Islands has this iconic wildlife, and you've talked about a few of the species, the famous giant tortoises, the land iguanas. There's also the marine iguanas, the famous finches, sometimes called Darwin's finches. Do you have a favorite animal or a favorite Galapagos species?
I can't say that I have a favorite animal any more than I have a favorite island or even a favorite location on this planet. But having said that, there are certain things that animals here do that I never ever get tired of seeing. The plunge dive of blue-footed boobies who hit the water at 100 kilometers per hour and can maneuver in 3 feet of water. I've seen them from above, from below. It's just something that absolutely blows me away, no matter how often I see it. And I can kind of say the same thing about the marine iguanas. I have seen thousands of marine iguanas underwater, and there isn't once when I'm not totally blown away by just seeing these animals in an environment that is completely alien and just amazing. It's just, only in Galapagos can you have that. But that doesn't discount all the other animals. I absolutely love sea turtles, and this is a haven for green turtles. They come to sleep in the mangroves, they nest on the beaches. I'm doing a book on sea turtles of the world right now, so I'm just in the best place you can imagine. Again, there isn't a single one.
So I've been lucky enough to visit Galapagos several times as both a tourist and a researcher, and I've personally always found it to be just this magical place where it feels like you can really experience nature in almost a primal way. And I think a lot of visitors have a similar kind of experience. But I'm wondering, as a longtime resident, what is something that visitors to Galapagos don't see or miss out on?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more about the primal connection, the primal experience that Galapagos can offer. And I think that's actually a very important part of allowing visitors to Galapagos, because Galapagos has something to teach the world about our connection, our primal connection to nature. But the part that visitors don't get to see is a one-on-one solitary experience. There is nothing like falling asleep in the mist and waking up in the mist all alone and seeing the tortoises wake up in the mist. or any other experience like that, where you're not actually being shown Galapagos, but where you're actually living Galapagos. And if you've done research here, you might have had the opportunity to do that, but very often even researchers don't have the time or the opportunity to just have that personal, solitary, primal connection. And alone, our senses are very much different. They are much more finely attuned than when you're being guided, than when you're in a group, or even with, other co-researchers, or busy. Alone, that's what I love most, is just to sit and watch and experience and wait.
It's so funny you say that, because that one of my most lasting impressions and memories from Galapagos was when I got to go as a researcher, as an undergraduate student, to Santa Fe. And I was working with Martin Wikelski, who was working on marine iguanas at the time. And we had the opportunity to camp out on the island for a couple of nights. And I just remember one of the experiences there was seeing this Galapagos hawk up on a ridge. And it was a little far away, but I had my camera. I tried to take some photos. I'd take a shot, and then I would get a little bit closer and take another shot. And I kept, getting closer and closer. I thought at some point it was going to fly away. But by the end of that, I was sitting on the ridge next to the hawk, just me and the hawk, just admiring the spectacular view. And I mean, that's one of the amazing things about Galapagos too, right? Is that the wildlife don't have that fear of humans, and you can have those amazing close-up interactions. And that will stick with me for the rest of my life.
Absolutely.
This is Wild World. When we come back, we'll hear more from Galapagos resident Tui De Roy about her work in the Galapagos Islands and how her life there inspired her career as a nature photographer. The Rice University Traveling Owls program offers exciting intellectual itineraries to destinations around the globe. Traveling Owls trips serve as a catalyst for lifelong learning and strengthen bonds between Rice University alumni and friends. You don't have to be a Rice alum to participate in Traveling Owls programs. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls to see a list of upcoming trips. Welcome back to Wild World. This is Scott Solomon, and I'm joined by nature photographer and lifelong Galapagos resident, Tui De Roy. I'm curious, how has being a photographer affected your relationship with nature and wildlife in Galapagos?
Well, being a photographer, it took me a long time to realize this, has actually been an incredibly good tool for me to better understand nature, because we are inherently restless. Our minds wander. We see something and nothing more happens, and we watch it for a while, and then we start to look for something else. But when you're a photographer, you intensify your attention, because you're trying to get that slightly better angle, the slightly better tilt of the head, the slightly better light that comes an hour later. And for example, photography has taught me to discern, to see the different qualities of light in a way that I would have never learned to do without photography, especially in the days of film where light was pretty unforgiving. You either had good light or you didn't. Now you can actually edit it and improve it. But it enabled me to see that even on a cloudy day, it's not the same light one day or even 1 hour than another. There are days when it's cloudy and all the colors glow. There are days when it's cloudy and everything looks gray. And so there are so many subtleties. And then traveling around the world, I learned, to my surprise, that the light in different places is actually very different and looks different. And so photography really has connected me to nature, because it has intensified the way I look at it.
I'm curious also, because you've done some work in conservation and protecting the species in Galapagos. How has your long experience in Galapagos, as well as your photography, kind of influenced your work in conservation?
Well, it goes hand in hand, because if you love what you do and you love what you see and photograph, then obviously you want to help save it. You want to help preserve it because you understand it and you can see what's happening to these creatures, and you want to be a part of the solution. And that doesn't apply just in Galapagos, it applies to the way I feel about nature everywhere. And for example, I don't eat fish because I don't eat wildlife. I'd much rather see a fish swimming in the sea than dead on my plate. You know, they taste good, but I don't eat wildlife. I don't eat tortoises. I don't, it just seems shocking to me. And yet I know an awful lot of conservationists who don't actually make that connection, and I don't understand that. So I live what I love, and I take that wherever I go.
What are some of the biggest challenges in conservation right now in Galapagos?
The single biggest challenge in conservation in Galapagos, now and ever since the islands were discovered back in 1535, is that humans slowly but surely have broken down the ecological barrier that separated them from the rest of the world. 600 miles of open ocean meant substantial biological isolation. And that isolation has been broken down by our comings and goings. And they continue today at an accelerated pace. And no matter how hard we try to eliminate the species that were introduced before and prevent new species from being introduced, we're only partially successful at either. And sadly, there are more and more new species being introduced. And generally speaking, the smaller, the worse they are, because they're much harder to control. So we're talking insects, seeds, diseases. They're almost impossible to get on top of. And so there are, pretty rigorous quarantine regulations, but the barrier is broken and things get through. Organisms get through. And so that problem will never go away. And even if people were to leave Galapagos today, there are so many people in the world by now that others would fill in the space. Illegal fishing would become rampant if there was nobody here to say, no, we don't want fishing, we want tourism.
Yeah, absolutely. You have written 13 books about the Galapagos Islands that feature your incredible photography, and it's been in dozens of magazines. I actually have a copy of your latest book, A Lifetime in Galapagos, on my coffee table at the moment, and it's fantastic. You've photographed so much. It really is wonderful. I'm curious, is there anything in the Galapagos Islands that you've wanted to see or photograph but haven't yet been able to?
Many, many, many things. Not necessarily the most obvious ones. There are different species of geckos on different islands that I haven't photographed them all. And then, of course, there are many different behaviors that I haven't been able to photograph. I may have photographed the species. There are even locations that I haven't yet been to. Not many, but... And even the things that I have photographed, I can photograph differently and I believe better. So, it's hard for me to enumerate, but I will never run out of photo subjects in Galapagos, or for that matter, anywhere I go, because every time I go somewhere in the world, I want to go back.
You recently had an incredible opportunity to go into the deep sea with famed oceanographer Sylvia Earle. What was that like? What did you see?
Yes, joining Sylvia Earle in her submarine and seeing her smile like a little child at something that she has already seen hundreds and thousands of times was an incredible experience. She actually took me down personally. There was just the two of us and the pilot, and we went down to 300 meters. It was unbelievable. Needless to say, there's not a whole lot of life down there, but it's another world. It's another constellation. And being able to see it alongside Sylvia, whom, by the way, I met for the first time here in Galapagos in 1969 when she was on an oceanographic expedition. And I remember that meeting. And she does too. And so it was absolutely beyond words. But there was a second layer to that experience, because in the 60s or so, my parents for a while were collecting specimen seashells and shipping them to museums and at times to private collectors. And my dad came up with the idea of dredging, of seeking out what lives in deeper water than you can reach by diving. So he built a dredge, and we had a hand crank winch on the back of our little boat, and we would go dredging down to about 100 to 200 meters, not usually as deep as we went with Sylvia, but almost. And all of the seashells that came up from that depth, almost all of them were new to science. So there's all sorts of species that were named. My mum made contact with all sorts of different museums and specialists in different families of seashells, and many of the shells were named after my parents. And so here I was looking at some of the critters that were down there that we only saw snippets of that came up in our dredge. And it just cast me back 40 or more years, 50 years, when we were exploring those depths with a very crude instrument. And we actually, nobody has ever dredged or explored those seashells before or since. My parents did so. And here we were, gliding along in those depths, looking at sea stars, at cup corals, things that I remember seeing in the dredge. We didn't see any of the shells that we discovered, but some of the other invertebrates we did, and fish.
Wow, what an incredible experience. Just amazing.
Absolutely.
I'm so happy for you. Tui, thank you so much for sharing your time, your memories, and your unique perspective on the Galapagos Islands. When we come back, we'll see Galapagos from yet another perspective, one that's accessible to just about anyone. I love to travel and experience new places, and I've had the great pleasure of joining several Rice Traveling Owls trips operated by Lindblad Expeditions. Each of these trips, from the Galapagos Islands to the Belize Barrier Reef, Baja California, and the upper Amazon River, has been absolutely incredible. Lindblad Expeditions make nature and wildlife accessible to anyone. Visit alumni.rice.edu/travelingowls or expeditions.com to learn more and to see where in our wild world you'd like to explore next. Tui's perspective as a lifelong resident of the Galapagos Islands adds a personal touch to her photos that allow us to briefly glimpse this magical place the way she does. But I think that everyone that visits these islands comes away changed. That was certainly true for Charles Darwin, and it was true for me as well. And while there's no substitute for visiting Galapagos in person, a new exhibit at the Houston Zoo will offer visitors a chance to get a sense for what it's like to be there. The Houston Zoo's new Galapagos Islands exhibit is scheduled to open on April 7th, 2023. I had a very special opportunity to get a behind-the-scenes sneak preview from Houston Zoo President and CEO Lee Ehmke.
This will be the first thing people see when they come into the zoo. And the idea was to create, as much as we can in a limited space, the sense of going to the Galapagos Islands.
We donned our construction hats and opened the gate into the new exhibit, still under construction.
So,
and this will be the sea lion.
Sea lion habitat.
Yeah.
Which,
beautiful.
A little hard to see, but we've done a lot. Really trying to get the details of the geology and the tide line life. So there's barnacles and Sally liked.
I see the crabs. Yeah, can't miss those.
Yeah. Actual entrance to the exhibit is just a little bit ahead here.
Entering a narrow canyon made of simulated rock, we walked past some statues of marine iguanas.
There they are. It was the animal that made me decide to become a biologist.
They are extraordinary. I'm sorry we can't get ours to spit salt out of their nostrils and do all the things.
You don't have any robotic iguanas sneezing salt?
No. They are extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Godzilla.
Up ahead is the Galapagos tortoise exhibit. It's got small hills and craters meant to replicate the rocky, mountainous terrain that the tortoises experience in their native land.
One of the things that people don't understand about them is how athletic they really are.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing because they don't look very nimble when you see them.
No. And so this is intentionally created to give them a lot of opportunities to climb and boulder and do all the things that they would do. They don't do in a zoo typically because they're in a flat paddock, but here they'll have
Not a lot of
wallows
flat
have been
spaces.
built in, a pool that this will be actually full of water in the front.
Oh, okay.
Next, we enter an automatic sliding door that blends into the simulated lava rock. From inside, you'll be able to watch the tortoises up even closer through a large window. There's also a display on how the Galapagos reptiles evolved from mainland ancestors. An enclosure featuring iguanas provides another example of the process.
We're going to use Caribbean iguanas, and then tell the story of island speciation, how it's happened several times in different places. Floated from mainland South America and became a different animal over time.
Continuing on through the indoor part of the exhibit, we enter a large space surrounded by rocky walls, which open onto a different view of the sea lion habitat.
This is the sea cave.
Wow.
So one of my favorite, there's a lot of favorite views in here, but the view through, there's a swim tunnel that leads to the other side of the exhibit there, which we know sea lions coming and going through that is going to be
Oh, that's going to be
awesome.
cool. Yeah. This is where my kids are going to be hanging out, I can guarantee.
We then entered a tunnel that curves down and to the right. Coming around the bend, we approached a clear tunnel that passes through the water in the sea lion enclosure.
So we've been above, we've gone on land, we've been sort of semi under the ground, and now we're going underwater.
Okay.
The sunlight is passing through the water above us, illuminating the entire tunnel and creating dazzling patterns of light on the floor and ceiling that dance about as we pass through.
This is the place we're never going to get anyone out of. Because
Yes, I can already tell.
Cool.
Yeah.
We think the sea lions are going to love watching people as much as we like watching them. So I think they'll be quite entertained by the people running through this tunnel.
Emerging from the sea lion tunnel, we enter a gallery with large photos of Galapagos wildlife. In the center of the space are empty cylindrical columns.
These columns will be filled with plastic waste of 3 different kinds: straws, plastic water bottles, and plastic bags, all of which the zoo several years ago in some cases has stopped using. So we're no longer offering that. And this shows kind of the volume that didn't go into the waste stream because we're no longer providing that. And then just a sense that that's something everyone can be cognizant of and do in their daily lives. And then
Next, we round a corner and see a sight that really took my breath away.
Oh, gosh. It's beautiful. Wow.
They're so colorful.
Oh, my gosh. This is great.
In front of us is a window into a massive aquarium with a simulated coral reef and hundreds of brightly colored fish.
This is about less than half of what will eventually be the full population in here, and we'll also be introducing some larger sharks, and then one green sea turtle will also be added to the mix. This was designed to look at there's coral reef habitats, but there's also sort of the recent lava flow, so we have both of those represented here. It's designed so it looks like you're at the edge of the abyss, and that's all lighting and blue paint, basically, that makes that work.
Yeah, it does look like you're just staring off into the deep ocean.
Yeah.
That's neat. This is another place you're going to have a hard time getting people to move on from.
I really could have watched those fish all day, but eventually we did have to move on. A walkway through a simulated lava tube brought us back up to surface level, where some smaller aquariums will house seahorses, sea cucumbers, and other smaller inhabitants of the Galapagos Seas. The last big exhibit is sure to be a highlight for many visitors: the penguins.
Oh, this is cool. That really does look like you're in Galapagos.
Yeah, no, that was We've got the best zoo muralist in the world, who I've worked with for years, who came in to do that.
The enclosure is indoors, but the illusion created by the mural makes it look like you can see far off into the distance, with a mountain covered in cactus and a sky dotted with clouds just beginning to catch the colors of what promises to be another spectacular Galapagos sunset. I had a lot more questions for Lee, so after the tour, we sat down to talk more about the exhibit and how it came to be. So, what were your goals in creating this new Galapagos Islands exhibit?
Well, it started out fairly simple, as we needed a new sea lion exhibit. Our sea lions have been living in their habitat at the Houston Zoo really almost unchanged since the 1950s. We did a master plan a few years ago, and one of our goals was that every new exhibit that we build, we want it to relate to conservation programs that the zoo is engaged in or supporting around the world. Now, California sea lions are doing just fine in California, and there's really no major conservation issue there. But we have a senior veterinarian who pointed out that there are sea lions very similar to the California sea lions we have at the zoo that live in the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands is a place the Houston Zoo has had a long history of doing conservation work in. So the light bulb went off at that point, and we said, let's not just do a sea lion exhibit. Let's do a sea lion exhibit set in the context of the Galapagos Islands and be able to tell many, many more stories about the wildlife, the conservation issues, and how it relates to things here in Houston. And it kind of grew from there into the biggest project that we've ever done at the Houston Zoo.
So am I correct that the new Houston Zoo exhibit is the only zoo exhibit anywhere that focuses on the Galapagos Islands?
It is, as far as we know. I mean, many zoos have Galapagos tortoises because Galapagos tortoises were brought from the Galapagos Islands over 100 years ago and have bred and are found in many zoos around the world. But other wildlife from the Galapagos is not so available for exhibit. And so as far as I know, no zoo has attempted to do it, partly because you can't have actual Galapagos animals. The government of Ecuador, which the Galapagos is part of, is very strict on any exportation of animals, which they should be. It's obviously a very important spot, and they're concerned about smuggling of animals going out. So what we're doing is using animals that are very similar to the species you'd find in the Galapagos that represent them, but that are actually found as part of programs for breeding programs in U.S. zoos. So, for example, instead of Galapagos penguins, we will have Humboldt penguins. There's a large population of Humboldt penguins in U.S. zoos. They look very similar to the Galapagos penguins, fill the same niche, but are part of a sustainable program here in the U.S. and will essentially be representing their Galapagonian cousins in the exhibit here at the zoo. Similarly with iguanas, there are no Galapagos iguanas in any zoo in the world. They only are found in the Galapagos Islands. And so we're using Caribbean iguanas, Caribbean blue iguanas, as sort of stand-ins for, again, the Galapagos species. So what we're trying to do instead is really represent the landscape and the seascapes of the Galapagos through exhibit design to really create a sense of place, and then have these animals exhibited in ways that they can do their natural behaviors. You'll get to see them much as you would if you did go to the Galapagos, but not doing anything that would interfere with the populations that are actually being protected on the Galapagos Islands.
So talk a little bit about what goes into the decisions behind which animals to have in the exhibit. Since you mentioned that you can't have all of the species that actually live in Galapagos, what are the decisions like that you guys have to make in terms of what goes in?
Well, a lot of it was, what would be available and sustainable in U.S. zoo and aquarium populations. So a lot of the animal selections were based on that. We also wanted to represent a series of very different habitats and environments. So we went from, the land animals, the iguanas and the giant tortoises, to the open ocean animals, sharks and rays, et cetera. So what's available, what tells great stories, and what creates a great visitor experience. So that's sort of the matrix of things that we use to come up with the eventual collection plan that we've developed.
And, walking through the exhibit, it really does feel like you're in the Galapagos Islands. And I know there was a lot of work that went into trying to create rocks and views that kind of replicate the experience of being in Galapagos. Tell me a little bit about that. I'm guessing you have like artists that are working on actually trying to give people that experience.
We do, and that was really a key element, is that we want that sense of place. We want people to come to the zoo and understand that animals are part of a bigger thing, the landscapes they live in or the seascapes they live in. So we did a lot of research up front, did trips to the Galapagos and taking lots of photos, doing research with scientists who are working in the Galapagos to try to get the details as correctly down as possible. But then in the end, as you said, it's art. We have sculptors and painters and people who build exhibits. Some of the very best in the world worked on this project. And our goal was to make it seem as though you were transported to the Galapagos Islands. So the geology, the plants, the seascapes, all of that have the look, feel, and even the sound of being in the Galapagos Islands.
Yeah, I mean, it really works. I mean, it's super cool. So one of the animals that you'll have in the exhibit that is a species native to Galapagos are the giant tortoises. And giant tortoises are these amazing animals. I mean, they can live more than 100 years. How old are the tortoises that you'll have in your exhibit?
We have a range. We actually have some that are only a few years old. They're small. They're not giant yet, but eventually they will be, up to, I think the oldest ones we have are about 60 years old right now. So they're still middle age in Galapagos tortoise terms. But you'll be able to see a range of sizes and ages of the animals as they navigate their exhibit. And it is amazing. I mean, some of the records indicate 140, 160 years, which is an incredible lifespan. And you think about the history that those animals have lived through, essentially, the history of civilization in some ways. So one of the things we've all said is that, these tortoises are going to outlive many of the people who've been involved in creating this exhibit. And we've had some donors who were able to name it and talk about a legacy, living, something that's going to be part of Houston for many, many years, are some of these tortoises that we have at the zoo.
Do you have a favorite animal in the exhibit?
Ooh, I'm not allowed to have a favorite animal. I am, as a kid, I was very, very interested in reptiles. So I'm excited about, obviously, the tortoises and the iguanas, but really they're all amazing. I know that many of our guests and people at the zoo are very excited about penguins, because we've never had penguins at the Houston Zoo before. And they are an inherently incredibly popular animal that I think it will be exhibited really in a unique and fun way at the zoo. So we just had some of our first penguins arrive from other zoos just this week. And I know the excitement level is very high around their arrival.
Now, some people might think Houston and penguins and feel like, wait, how is that going to work? So tell me a little bit about what goes into having a penguin exhibit in a warm place like Houston.
It involves a building and air conditioning and separate air systems. So that's been the impediment for, obviously, people think of penguins and cold, but it's interesting because the Galapagos penguins live on the equator. And
right.
That is something not many people are aware of. But the waters in the Galapagos are quite cool. And so they've evolved to survive there. The Humboldt penguins that we're exhibiting come from the southern coast of South America. So they're not the Antarctic penguins, but even though they're warm water penguins, they'd have a tough time with the Houston summers outdoors. So we've built a beautiful indoor space that recreates all the things that they would have outdoors in the wild, but it's air conditioned and temperature controlled in a way that will allow them to thrive.
To me, one of the most memorable experiences of actually being in Galapagos is having close encounters with animals. And of course, the animals there, they don't have much fear of humans, so you really do get up close with them. But having close encounters with animals is also something that can happen when visiting a zoo. And so I'm curious, what do you think it is about interacting with animals that can have such a deep impact on us as people?
I think we're just hardwired for it. Biophilia. We all, there's an innate sense of the love of nature, and to be close, to experience them. It's amazing. Technology, everyone says, well, why do we need a zoo when we've got all this great nature photography and cinematography that's out there? It's still different. The reality of seeing an animal and feeling its presence is something that can't be replaced. And I think that's why zoos remain magical and popular. And we want to take advantage of that and take the opportunity to have people fall in love with these animals and understand that everyone has a role in conserving them. And that by coming to the zoo, you're actually helping to support the conservation work that we're doing with our partners around the world. And there are things that everyone can do in their daily lives that will have a positive impact on the environment and therefore on these animals that you've just fallen in love with.
Yeah, speaking of which, the Houston Zoo's slogan is "See them, save them." So how can visiting the zoo help save animals in wild places like Galapagos?
Sure. Well, number one is the zoo spend 6% of our annual operating budget on direct field conservation. We are supporting researchers and field conservationists around the world, and our staff are involved in that as well. And that's significantly more than what most other zoos are able to do because we have a very strong business model in Houston, and we're able to generate revenue that goes directly to conservation. So that's one. Number two, we're also participating in a number of breeding programs for endangered species, some of which are found here in Texas, and actually reintroducing them to the wild. So again, just by visiting the zoo, guests are supporting that work. There are two species here in Texas, the Houston toad and the Atwater's prairie chicken, that would not exist on planet Earth if it wasn't for the efforts of the Houston Zoo and our partners. We are actively working to propagate them at the zoo and in nearby areas, and then reintroduce them back into their natural habitat. And it's been quite successful in recent years. But again, those are, small, I don't want to call it obscure, but they're not the big charismatic animals that people think of at the zoo, but they're important. They're elements of the ecosystem that we want to make sure survive, beyond next year. And that would not have been the case if the zoo wasn't doing that work. And then third, and maybe most importantly, is that we have 2 million people a year come to the zoo, and we have a chance to impact them in a way, whether it's, just a brief moment where they connect with an animal, or they can dig in deeper to the content that we offer in our exhibits to think about what they can do in their daily lives that might have a positive impact on the environment, from the simplest things, from not doing single-use plastic use when you can avoid it, recycling. I mean, it's all some of the basic stuff, but I think a visit to the zoo can reinforce that. And we have the opportunity, and I think the obligation, to have people come to our zoo, understand many of these animals that they're seeing are endangered, and there are things that you can do in your life that will help save them. That includes donating to our conservation fund, becoming a member, going to a zoo camp or zoo class, but it's sort of a holistic approach to conservation, which is coupled with the direct conservation work that we do with our partners and with the animals that we're doing assurance breeding programs with.
So what is the number one thing that you hope visitors to the Galapagos exhibit will take away?
That they love the animals that they see, and they understand that they're part of an amazing place in the world and maybe, some of them will actually have a chance to visit it. We know most people never will. So I think that's one of the great things about a zoo, is for people who live in the city all their lives and might not have a chance to get out, will have the opportunity again to fall in love with the animals and to care.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait for people to get the opportunity to go and to see it and experience it. I really do think it's the next best thing to being able to go to the Galapagos directly. So yeah. Thanks so much for the opportunity to see a little preview of the exhibit and to hear more about it.
No, my pleasure. And again, April 7th, we'll be opening it up. We're expecting lots of people will want to come and see it. So I hope all your listeners take the opportunity to come. This will be, among other things, the first thing you see when you come into the zoo. So it's really going to set the tone for all the other exhibits that we have currently built and that we'll be building in the future. One other note is that a lot of it is actually indoors and air conditioned. So we know in the hot Houston summer, that's going to add to the experience of coming to our zoo, and it's just going to be great.
I know I'm definitely planning on visiting a lot and going with the family, and I'm sure everybody's going to love it.
Great. Well, thank you. And it sounds like you've had the opportunity to visit the Galapagos Islands. I've been lucky enough to go a couple of times as well, and there is really no place like it on Earth. And so couldn't be more excited about bringing at least a taste of that experience to our guests here in Houston.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lee.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. To learn more about Tui De Roy, visit her website, tuideroy.com. That's TUIDEROY.com. You'll see some of her amazing photographs from Galapagos and elsewhere. You can also find links to her many publications, including 2 new books with Princeton University Press, a pocket guide to birds of Galapagos, and a lifetime in Galapagos. I have both, and they really are outstanding. The Houston Zoo's Galapagos Islands exhibit opens on April 7th, 2023.
Visit their website, houstonzoo.org, to see photos and videos of the exhibit and its inhabitants, and to get tickets. We've also got some images of the new exhibit on our website, wildworldshow.com. For more information about the Galapagos Islands, visit the Galapagos Conservancy's website at galapagos.org. This episode of Wild World was produced by 3 Wire Creative with support from Lindblad Expeditions and the Rice Alumni Traveling Owls. Visit alumni.rice.edu/traveling owls or expeditions.com to get more information about their trips to the Galapagos Islands and other destinations, and to book your cabin for the experience of a lifetime. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Scott Solomon. Join me next time as we explore another part of our wild world. On the next episode of Wild World, we cross the high seas and take a dive into them as well. We'll need a wetsuit and some sunscreen, but this is no vacation. It's about the very future of our planet.